Over to you, Divyangana.
All right, all right. So the webinar is now being recorded. All right. Greetings, everyone, and a very warm welcome from OP Jindal Global University and the Center for India-Australia Studies for today's webinar on strategies for increasing women in executive leadership and governance roles. The webinar aims to understand reasons for witnessing fewer women as executive directors and in key managerial roles, that is, fewer women occupying key governance and leadership positions from inside the company. The first step in the appointment process is the shortlisting and recommendation of potential candidates for executive directors and senior management roles by what is called as the Nomination and Remuneration Committee. The Nomination and Remuneration Committee is generally a subcommittee of the Board of Directors. Our focus is on the first step and on the actions of this particular committee. Australia and India draw a similarity in requiring every listed company to establish a nomination committee. While it is voluntary for Australian listed companies to establish such a committee, it is mandatory for India under Section 178 of the Companies Act 2013. Panelists are invited to discuss factors that are or ought to be considered by the nomination committee before recommending a directorial or leadership candidate. Generally, companies tend to use what is called as the competency-based approach to enable corporate progression. A key dimension of the discussion today is firstly, whether competency alone should be a determinative factor for vertical mobility in a company, or should other factors play a key role, such as gender. And secondly, whether factors identified by the nomination committee translate to those considered by bodies who are empowered to appoint women directors and leaders, that is, members or shareholders of a company who appoint directors by passing an ordinary resolution during general meetings. And of course, when it comes to senior management, it is a decision that is taken by the board of directors. The discourse intends to culminate with legal and policy recommendations for organizations and governments to facilitate improved gender representation in senior roles. With this background in mind, it gives me tremendous joy to welcome and introduce our guest of honor for today, Ms. Sree Kirlew, Australian Consul General to South India. Ms. Kirlew is an accomplished diplomat with a distinguished career of over 16 years at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or the Department. She has been an invaluable and dedicated career officer with the Department, specializing in the Indo-Pacific region. Through her noteworthy contribution as the Foreign Trade and Policy Advisor, Australia's strategy for the Indo-Pacific was curated. Prior to joining the Chennai office as the Australian Consul General to South India, Ms. Kirlew served as the head of the Indo-Pacific Division at the department, where she worked on a diverse range of geo-economic issues. She has successfully managed international relations with engagements at Beijing, New Delhi, and Cairo. Her impressive qualifications include a Master's of Public Policy and Management from the University of London, in addition to a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Sydney. Handing it over now to Ms. Kirlew to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Divyangana, for that very warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here today with such a panel of experts to discuss a topic that I myself care very deeply about. And, you know, of course, I cannot have favorites amongst our Australian Alumni Grant Scheme projects, but look, if I were having favorites, this one would be right up there. I'd like to start by acknowledging the organisers of this extremely interesting event. Divyangana, who's Assistant Professor at the OP Jindal University, for having the vision to bring us together today, and noting that she's an alumni of the University of New South Wales. This project we were pleased to contribute some funding towards through our Australian Alumni Grant Scheme. That's a project where we give some seed funding for really great ideas from people who have studied in Australia and returned to India. It's a way of us giving back to people who've committed to an education in Australia, and also to remaining part of that connection, diaspora connection, living bridge between our two countries. I would also like to thank my acknowledged to Professor Simran Binder from the Jindal Global Law School, who has been working with Professor Dhankar on this project, and Sean Starr from the Centre for India-Australia Studies. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow panellist, Dr. Terry Fitzsimmons from the University of Queensland, and a special link to the University of Queensland. When I was posted in New Delhi, Peter Varghese, who's now the Chancellor of UQ, was our High Commissioner, and Peter went back to be our Foreign Secretary and was instrumental in establishing DFAT's Women in Leadership agenda. So there's a really nice connection there. Thank you to Ms. Catherine Maxwell, Ms. Sree Patel, and Ms. Kalpana Unadkat. I'm really looking forward to hearing your views. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from each other. I thought I'd just set a few framing remarks around the stats in Australia for women on boards, and then perhaps talk about some of my own personal experiences and the experiences of the Foreign Service. So, Australia outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex, which takes in both gender and sexual orientation, in 1984. And we've had a version of what is now called the Workplace Gender Equality Act since then, with an accompanying bureaucratic agency to look at how we can address this issue. In 2012, the name was altered to the Workplace Gender Equality Act to give new emphasis to equality measures which also benefit men as an important part of this discourse. So the goals of the Act and the accompanying agency are to promote and improve gender equality, including equal remuneration between men and women in employment and in the workplace, to support employers to remove barriers to the full and equal participation of women in the workplace, to promote amongst employers the elimination of discrimination on the basis of gender, including in relation to family and caring responsibilities, which remain so very gendered actually in the division of responsibility in many families, to foster workplace consultation between employers and employees on issues concerning workplace gender equality, to improve the productivity and competitiveness of Australian business through the advancement of gender equality in employment. So that's making that business case for diversity, showing that diverse organisations perform better. And I think another really important part of the Act and the agency is that they collect a really rich mine of data that has allowed some quite advanced academic study, again, making that case for diversity. Of course, this is still a work in progress. One of my favourite stats was that in 2015, there were more men named Peter than women running Australia's top 200 companies. So 26 men called Peter and 23 women, which I think is a pretty extraordinary thing. The latest data set is from 2019-20, where things had improved a little bit. As of that time, women held 32.5% of key management positions in Australian companies, 28.1% of directorships, 18.3% of CEO roles, and 14.6% of board chairs. But of course, there's so much more to do. This webinar is going to talk about the private sector. I work very much in the public sector, but there are similarities. And I thought I would talk to you about the process of selecting people for positions like mine. So head of posts, we call them, they're head of mission or a head of a consulate to serve overseas, because there's a similar kind of filtering. People put their names forward, they are considered by a staffing committee within the bureaucracy, and then a list of names goes to the foreign minister. So we could see an analogy there with the shortlisting committees of private sector boards. So, I think there have been 5 impactful actions that the Foreign Service has taken, and I'm going to run you through those. DFAT launched a Women in Leadership strategy in 2015, and so it's completed its initial 5-year phase and has been rolled over to a second 5-year phase. When they started that strategy, only 25% of these head of post roles were held by women. In 5 years, they've been able to raise that to 44%, so quite a big increase. And similar improvements were made at senior levels of management, where they took the number of women, or the percentage of women holding what we would call a senior executive service to a role, quite some terminology there, from 27% to nearly 50%. So I think that shows, those stats and data is so important, show that by putting some actions in place, you can make very meaningful change and make it quite quickly over that 5-year period. So what did DFAT do? The first action was to make the case for diversity, to say we would be a better performing organisation if we had a leadership team that looked more like the makeup of our overall workplace, which was at that stage roughly 50-50 men and women. As I said before, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency is collecting some really good data, and so we can see how that maps to the private sector too. A 2020 study based on 6 years of Australian company gender reporting established that companies who appointed a female CEO increased their market value by 5%, worth nearly $80 million to the average ASX 200 company, and increasing the number of women in other key leadership positions by 10% or more increased a company's market value by 6.6%. And conversely, companies who reduced the number of women in leadership roles suffered a loss in value of around 3%. A separate study of US Fortune 500 companies found women-led teams were more creative, registering 20% more patents on average. So the public service was able to draw on that record of data to show that diverse teams led to better performance. In the public sector, there's also something of a mandate to be an employer of excellence, to be leading some of this discourse in Australia, to be showing how simple changes can make a big impact. The second thing that the department did was to set targets. So we have a 40-40-20 target for the gender breakdown of leadership positions. Targets, of course, are not quotas, but they have been found to have a very important signalling normative effect, particularly for selection panels. And, this is something that's applied actually at all levels of selection, not only for very senior roles. And having sat on various selection panels myself, when you get your list, when you've shortlisted and you see that there's some kind of gender imbalance, it does prompt you to go back, to pause, to look again at the competency of candidates from the non-dominant gender and say, well, why is it that we didn't consider those? Are we not being open-minded enough about the way this job could be done? The third thing was some training for selection panels on unconscious bias. We all have unconscious bias. We all bring to our decision-making a series of fast brain processes that associate one thing with another. Here, one of my favorite stats is the fact that something like 60% of US CEOs are more than 6 feet tall, whereas only 14% of the average US male population is. Western white culture has this deeply held association, an unconscious bias that tall people make better and more commanding leaders. I've felt it myself when reaching for a pair of high heels before an important meeting. But of course, height has no proven link to our ability to make good decisions or wise management ones. So all of our DFAT panels have now been trained on unconscious bias, trained to say, look, you will bring unconscious bias. The important thing is to recognize it in yourself, to stop, reflect, think about how you can address that. The fourth thing we did was to normalize flexible work for men and women at all levels. It's probably been more impactful at sort of middle and junior management, but those, of course, are the feeder ranks for more senior positions. And what that tries to do is not address a glass ceiling, but a leaky pipe. that says women, primarily women in childbearing years, often step back from their career. They need to find a way to juggle the demands of home and office. And if a workplace doesn't put in place proactive measures to keep them connected, it's very easy for those women to sort of step out of the workforce altogether, or to fall into a kind of stream of work that is not on a career track to promotion. I've benefited from a number of these structures myself in my career, both for child rearing and also for study. So I completed my master's after I'd had my first child, when I was already holding like a middle junior management position. You know, these flexible work arrangements are still primarily taken up by women, 75% to 25% within the department, but I am seeing a shift. So in teams I was managing in Canberra before I left, more and more of the fathers in those teams were also taking up flexible work, and normalizing that means that there's less of a punitive impact on women who do in terms of career progression. And the fifth impactful thing that we did was to encourage women to encourage other women. You can't be what you can't see. So you need women acting as role models and mentors. And at times I felt uncomfortable about this because, you know, why should women support other women rather than the system supporting everybody equally? But we are addressing the fact that women are very often starting from further behind. And it becomes a reinforcing cycle. The more women there are in leadership, the more normalized it is that women should be in leadership. You know, a colleague last night we were sort of sharing stories about when these job vacancies come up, and her role heading another of our overseas missions has been advertised. And she said it was really notable to her that when people wrote seeking advice, the women were so much more inclined to downplay their claims and say, I'm sure you're very busy and you might not have time, and I'm not even sure I'm qualified, but I'm just testing if maybe you think I should apply. And, you know, she very much saw it as her role to lean in and say to these women, yes, put your name forward. You never know. Test your skills against the cohort. So, you know, as I started with the stats at the beginning, these 5 actions, and there are more, there's a whole strategy, but for me, these are some that are really worth drawing attention to, have helped to shift the dial at DFAT. And so you start to see a different complexion to the leadership team, more women, more people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, more people from diverse gender and sexual orientation. But it takes time and it takes ongoing effort. So I'm really pleased to be part of this panel discussion today. I'm sure I'm going to learn some good tips that I can feed back to our management structures, and we have a formal Women in Leadership Advocates process that enables that. So very much looking forward to it. Thank you again for having me, and congratulations to the project organisers.
Thank you so much for that insightful opening session and for sharing the 5 key points for enhancing women at workplace. We're definitely seeing a shift in focus from more traditional forms of leadership that were primarily occupied by men, evident from the fact that there were more men named Peter than women on boards. But of course, now we are seeing an increase in diversity at workplace, which of course now sets the stage for me to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Terry Fitzsimmons, Senior Lecturer in Leadership with the University of Queensland Business School, Australia. Dr. Terry is a thought leader with expertise in examining gender within corporate governance and leadership. His doctorate analyzed key features of a successful CEO and differing pathways to such a role between men and women. Earlier this year, Dr. Terry and his team released a report entitled Towards Board Gender Parity, Lessons from the Past, Directions for the Future, that provides a comprehensive understanding of Australia's journey to stand as one amongst 3 countries in the world to cross the 30% female representation on its corporate boards without a gender quota. The report is indispensable by setting out important recommendations for Australia and other countries to enable gender parity in the boardroom. In June 2015, Dr. Terry completed a research project called Filling the Pool, commissioned by the Committee of Perth to investigate strategies for increasing participation and vertical mobility of women towards leadership roles in Western Australia. His work draws upon a sociological framework inspired by an eminent academic, Pierre Bourdieu, to explain and examine societal disparity, including gender inequality. Apart from his extensive and remarkable work in academia, Dr. Terry has practiced for over 30 years as a chartered accountant. He is the managing director of the Australian Gender Equality Council, AGEC, an organization committed at providing equal opportunities to Australian men and women, and whose impressive membership includes apex national bodies representing women interests such as the Australian Local Government Women's Association and the Australian Women Lawyers. I now invite Dr. Terry to share his thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'd like to build on what Sarah was saying around Australia's statistics and how it's very important to understand the complexity of this issue, and particularly when we're talking about board roles and CEO or executive roles. And while there's no doubt many overlaps, we are talking about two different things. And as an indicator of the different directions that those issues are taking, we've seen in Australia a remarkable rise since 2009, when we were at 8.3% women on our ASX 200 boards, to now at over 34%. And as was just said, leading the world, certainly in non-quota countries. But even quota countries that have adopted quotas often adopt a 30% rather than a 40%. So we are leading in this space, which is quite remarkable given the rest of our gender equality statistics are quite ordinary. Very ordinary, to be honest. We sit at 50th in the world with the World Economic Forum's rankings of Australia's gender, particularly around economic participation and political representation. So when we're talking about board roles, we need to be really careful that we distinguish some of the things that the nominations committee would be looking at for women on their board versus what they're looking at for CEO roles. And they are quite different. So let me begin by saying that one of the key outcomes from my thesis was what the chairs of ASIC, that's our peak governance body, or certainly our regulator around companies, had to say about CEO selection. And the very clear messaging around CEO selection was that you need to select a CEO with a profound depth and breadth of industry experience. And by that, they meant longevity of service, continuous service within an industry. And the moment you talk about continuous service, all of a sudden you have a gender issue because of women taking more breaks during their career than men do. They were also pointing to the, not only would you likely have more chance at profitability by hiring such a CEO, you also stood a lesser risk of being prosecuted for failures. And of course, Australia has one of the most onerous in terms of liability for its boards and its directors, which makes it, again, very difficult for boards to go outside the box and consider anything other than competence in its criteria for selecting board members, which I'll return to. And so the trajectory of Australian appointments of women CEOs in the ASX 200, while it's certainly rising across the board nationally, so as Sarah pointed out, we have a tremendous agency, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which maps private sector organisations with more than 100 employees. We are certainly seeing improvement in our key management positions, but particularly our CEO roles. But it's not true in our top listed company space. We're actually going backwards there. In recent years, we've gone from 13 out of 200 women CEOs to down to 10 now. Whereas we've seen this remarkable rise in not only women on boards, but also women chairs of boards, which is very important. And it's a point I want to make, that while nominations committees are technically responsible for the appointment of CEOs and board positions, it's always the chair that has the final word, or If they don't, they often leave. So if the committee disagrees with the chair's decision, it usually results in the chair leaving. So anyway, a little bit of background. It's certainly complex, but what I want to talk about particularly are the reasons behind the rise in the number of women on boards, what chairs are saying. So I'm going to kind of fall back on several of the studies that we've done at UQ, one that involved 45 ASX 200 chairs, where we interviewed them for an hour about why are you appointing women? And we deliberately chose chairs that hadn't had a woman on their board before and had been responsible for that appointment. So they weren't talking about what they had observed, but what they had done. I think that's really important. And also the work we did around why CEOs are selected. And this will come down to this capability argument and also why we have problems with the pipeline into senior roles, but also why we may see the number of women appointed in our ASX 200, 300 firms stall as well. And that's got to do with the board skills matrix, which again, I'll talk about. So one thing that Australia, and I'd say suffers from, is we have gender segregation in lots of ways. We have gender segregation around domestic workload. So how much time women relative to men spend on childcare and other domestic duties. There's a very disproportionate share where both partners are working goes to the woman. It's roughly a 1/3, 2/3 allocation of domestic work. Now, of course, if you're also working and trying to progress a career, that puts far more burden on women than men. And what we see, partly as a result of that, but also partly to do with gender stereotyping, is in Australia we have an occupational gender segregation. That is, women tend to be more dominant in support roles, clerical and administrative roles, legal, marketing, technical support roles. Men tend to be more dominant in terms of numbers in operational roles. And I'll come back to that. It's actually a critical factor in CEO selection and then later on board selection. The other deep segregation we have in Australia is industry segregation. There are only 8 of our 19 industry sectors that actually have a 40-40-20 split of men and women, which means we have 11 industries that are dominated by one group or the other. And in terms of why is that important in board space? The majority of our ASX listed companies, so certainly our large ones, our ASX 200 and 300 firms, are predominantly in male-dominated industries, mining, construction, engineering. You know, there are certainly exceptions, but if you were to take the composition of the ASX 200 and 300, you'll find that they are dominated by industries that happen to have way more men than women, which then becomes an issue around board appointments. It becomes an issue around the pool of candidates. So it's particularly a problem. So now I want to look particularly at CEO versus board roles. When we started having a look at, well, what is required to be a CEO? And we were looking very much at the ASX 200, 300. We spoke to 30 executive recruiters who operate predominantly in the CEO appointment space. We spoke to 30 chairs of ASX firms. We spoke to 60 successful CEOs about what is it that the nominations committee, particularly the chair, is looking for in candidates, and probably more importantly, how are they getting to that information? So as you would expect, or certainly I would have expected it, that it was the capability, not the gender, that they were looking at. They wanted someone who had leadership skills. They wanted someone who was highly strategic in their thinking, highly street smart, not necessarily IQ, but certainly high EQ and the ability to rapidly respond. They wanted someone with deep integrity, certainly no skeletons in the closet. They wanted someone who was highly confident or self-efficacious, and someone particularly who could be a steward for the entire business. That is, they understood every facet of the organisation. So they were completely across the supply chain and the value chain of their firm, and usually through having been in roles in most of those, or certainly with oversight over those roles. And straight away, you can see that that's an operational requirement. You have to have had operational experience to be able to be a good steward of the business, certainly in the minds of the chairs. So when we spoke to boards about what they were looking for in a director, that's slightly different. You know, a CEO has to be a master of many things, or certainly a master across most things, but they have to be kind of the conductor of an orchestra of specialists. So they have to be able to provide oversight over the entire firm. whereas a board is usually comprised from a board skills matrix. And the matrix comprises elements that the board requires to govern effectively. So they need someone with specific skills around law, around finance, around operations, supply chain. It depends on the firm, but broadly speaking, there's a matrix of roles. In Australia, we have an average board size of 7, which usually means that 2 of those roles will be accounting, finance, and the other one will be a legal corporate governance kind of role. And what we've seen in Australia, that women have predominated in acquiring those roles, mainly the finance roles and the legal roles, and not so much the operational roles. And this is because the pool of women in senior operational roles in Australia is quite small. And so boards have looked at, is gender important? Yes, it is. And as has already been said, there is a very strong business case that's been proven beyond any doubt. I think the causality of gender and firm outcomes is well established now, which means boards are alive to the fact that they need diversity, and particularly gender diversity, but they're also constrained in where that's coming from in the matrix. And so we're seeing a lot of women appointed to those 2 roles. Now, if you get 2 over 7, it's roughly 30%. And that's how we've gotten to that 30%. So when I say I'm fearful of moving further, it's because I think we're going to hit a bit of a wall with the operational requirements. Though we still need to keep the pressure up. And in fact, the AICD, which is one of our peak governance bodies, has been a strong advocate for bringing women on boards. And we're also seeing our institutional investors start to wield a bit of a stick in terms of expecting women's views to be there. So we need to continue with those, I guess, those strategies of understanding the value that women bring. But I think I just want to close, because I think I've gone over time already. I just want to close with what the chairs have said about why they're appointing on gender. So capability is a given. They have to have the skills required for the role. It's if you don't have that, you don't get a Guernsey straight away. But when it comes to the selection of a woman, what they've found is that women tend to enhance the debate, and they're more collaborative and collegiate in terms of board operations. They actually enhance male behaviours, so the men become more thoughtful, more considerate of board practices. They also provide clarity and focus. They're not as easily distracted as the men, and this is all coming from the male chairs' words, not mine. And that men don't wish to appear incompetent in front of a woman, so they tend to do more work in preparing for board meetings. Women are more likely to share views and assumptions of the board and actually ask why more often than men. And they do have different perspectives and a different worldview. And all those 6 characteristics are why chairs are wanting to recruit more women to their boards. And I've gone way over time, so I apologise.
Oh, no, that's absolutely all right, Dr. Terry. In fact, a wonderful presentation there, particularly from an academic context, since the discussion is strengthened by a framework that really explains or analyzes why is there a disparity in gender representation, not just on corporate boards, but also in the CEO roles. I think it's more in the leadership segment now than there is at the board level, as you had correctly pointed out. I know our project is keenly looking at some of these characteristics that should be possessed by a candidate at the CEO level as well as at the board level. And it's quite interesting that, there are different characteristics that are required at each level. And I think it's going to be more interesting to find out how the transition will take place from the CEO to the board level in terms of transitioning the skill set there, and how perhaps the board matrix will then, or maybe the skills matrix for the CEOs will be sort of accommodating that transition. We're also very keenly considering the PA Bordeaux approach to study and how it might interact with law and policy. So speaking of policy, it is a delight to welcome our next speaker from Australia, Ms. Catherine Maxwell, General Manager, Policy and Advocacy at the Governance Institute of Australia. Ms. Maxwell leads the Policy and Advocacy team at the Governance Institute of Australia, a representative body of risk, compliance and governance professionals. I must confess, I am an associate member of this amazing institution, and Catherine was my teacher for the subject of corporate governance. Therefore, what I know about Australia's corporate governance, I owe it entirely and most gratefully to her. Catherine has a strong background in corporate governance and management of stakeholder relations for over 20 years in various sectors, including private, public, and not-for-profit. She has worked with the Governance Institute for over 12 years, initially as the course director for its corporate governance course, and later as its general manager in policy and advocacy. Her substantial work experience includes service as senior manager, policy development at Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA as we know it. She has also served as the Senior Policy Advisor at the Australian Institute of Company Directors, or AICD, and Senior Policy Manager of the Financial Services Council. In the capacity of a Senior Executive Officer at the ASX, Catherine was instrumental in the revision of the ASX Corporate Governance Principles and Recommendations, second edition, that contained voluntary guidelines for listed companies to implement good governance practices and build sustainable investor relations. She has previously been engaged as a company secretary for Cancer Council New South Wales. Catherine is qualified in arts and law from the University of Sydney before commencing a decade-long career as a lawyer in Sydney and Hong Kong. I now hand it over to Catherine to take the discussion forward.
One of the nice things about being the course director for corporate governance is my students turn up all over the place. So it was a real treat to have Divyangana get in touch and ask me to do this. And I was listening to Dr. Fitzsimmons and sort of reflecting on the stats. I worked at AICD about 20 years ago, and we'd look at the board gender diversity statistics, and they'd kind of, I think it was about 9.3%, and it would kind of go up by 0.02% to 9.5, and then it'd go down again. And it really just kind of bounced around along a very flat base for a number of years, probably until about 10 years ago. And if you get a chance, read Dr. Fitzsimmons' study, but he identifies the ASX Corporate Governance Council as having had a big impact on the change in gender diversity. And I think that is about 10 years ago. So, but from that relatively low base, we've seen 2% growth each year in the top 300 every year for about 10 years. So, it's actually been quite a remarkable story. And I was at a meeting of my listed company secretaries recently, and we're definitely, the larger listed companies, investors are certainly driving this. 40-40-20 is really a big discussion, and that's an increasing push from the larger investor bodies. So I think that's going to become a much more out in the open discussion. And when I was thinking about preparing for today, I thought about maybe talking a little bit about the organisation I come from. So my members would typically support the boards of companies, and particularly listed companies. And when Sarah was talking about everyone being called Peter, certainly if you look at if the boards of directors were James or Ian or John or Peter, the company secretaries were too. A lot of our older members, our fellow members and our retired fellows, Peter, John, James, Ian, very common Christian names amongst that cohort. And so the pace of change, I think, with boards was just as slow with company secretaries. Governance Institute was started in 1909, and it took until 1927 to admit the first woman to membership. And thereafter, there was probably about one a year, maybe, until we started to see a couple a year between 1935 and 1945, at the end of the Second World War. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that we began to see consistently more than about 10 new women admitted to the organisation each year. And then it took another 30 plus years, so until 2015, before we began to see parity between the number of new members admitted, male and female. So if boards were not particularly gender diverse, nor were the people who served them, the company secretaries. And I think our historically low female membership really reflects a sort of societal trend. It really took a very long time for women to start to obtain the sorts of qualifications in law and accounting that Dr. Fitzsimmons was talking about, and get the tertiary qualifications plus the professional experience so that they could become eligible for membership. But then once you started to see that trend shift, we started to see the legal profession and the accounting profession open up to more women. And they're often, as Dr. Terry pointed out, they're often been feeder professions for board seats in Australia, which is a whole other debate. But certainly, I think the other thing too is that, since the 1960s, the number of women enrolling in tertiary education has steadily increased, and there was parity in about 1987. So I was kind of into my working career by that stage, which, makes me a bit old, but that's okay. I'm still alive. Over 50s, we're still making active contributions. And I think the last time I looked at the data for women in universities in Australia, there were more women than men. And in fact, women tended to complete their degrees, whereas men didn't necessarily. So we've seen that happen. I think there's a study, and Terry might be the man to do it. I think it would be fascinating to unpack what impact the fact that many of my generation had free university, they didn't pay to go to university, and what impact that had on the sort of growth of the professions. I think that's probably a whole study in itself. But certainly in the context, one of the most interesting things in terms of a study that we did of our member organisations, we're part of a global group, and we released in about March this year a global study of gender diversity on boards in our associated companies. But one of the most interesting things I found when I was doing the work to put that together, it's an article, it was a relatively small group by Gilding, Lusher and Bird in 2018. And it looked at the main drivers of women's participation on boards. And it found that the only significant predictor that boards will reach the 30% target is that they have a director who sits on another board that has already done so. They identified it, it was pre-pandemic, they called it a contagion effect. So that if there was one director who sat on another board, it was more likely that the board that they then came to would get to that 30% target. So this could be where an opportunity lies in terms of, increasing the gender diversity on boards. And if I think about the company secretaries of the top 20 listed companies in Australia, they are by and large women. So that is also, I think, interesting that the company secretaries are now looking more diverse than the boards that they serve. And it's quite interesting. I think Terry's absolutely right. There are still sectoral biases. There are some very large mining companies in Australia. The large ones, not too bad. But if you look down the smaller end, and our Board Gender Diversity Index identified this, the mining sector is among the worst offenders in terms of gender diversity. Which brings me to our Board Diversity Index. So we released that this year. It highlights that Australian boardrooms remain incredibly Anglo-Celtic and European, and so that based on current trends, it's going to take 18 years for the boardroom to be reflective of the diversity of Australian society more generally. So I think that's certainly an area that we need to look at. The other thing, it found that women are studying harder to reach the boardroom, so that they outstripped the new appointments, outstripped men in terms of every category of qualifications. They were more likely to have a PhD than the men, or have an MBA and formal governance qualifications. So they were better qualified than the men that they were competing with the skills. The other thing we saw, that skills, technology, healthcare and property experience are starting to entrench themselves at board level. So whilst it was typically law, accounting or a specialty, say for example in mining, we're now getting those other skills. And that the bias in favour of accounting and legal skills is beginning to come off a little bit. It had dropped, I think, 5% compared to the previous year. I think the other thing that our Board Diversity Index found was that On average, a male director continues to be slightly older than a female director. The average age of male directors is about 60 years. And there's a much higher proportion of women directors under 50 than men. But then that probably feeds into the sort of structural factors that we were talking about earlier in my presentation and that Terry was talking about. The average age range for an ASX board is between about 19 years. The youngest 27, the oldest was 89. We also released last month a study called The Future of the Board. It was based on a survey and then a workshop. Certainly, one of the findings was that board accountability and responsibility is really going to increase in the next few years. The other thing I think is that the pressure is going to be turned up on boards as shareholders and community expect directors to be more in tune with the whole range of ESG issues and non-financial risks, and navigating the fallout from the pandemic, and then responding to a sort of increased and complex regulatory and technology landscape. I think the ESG agenda is building, and boards need to ensure that they're engaging and reporting and acting on the sort of non-financial risks that are impacting on their boards. I think in terms of diversity, with significant recent steps forward on gender diversity, attention is really now going to be focused on the diversity of directors' skills, experience, and the attributes, with these highlighted as most important regarding board diversity and inclusion, gender and ethnicity being in third and fourth place. And I think if you've got greater diversity of thought, chairs are going to have to be managers of this diversity of perspectives. So there are going to have to be, possibly different skills among chairs. And as Dr. Fitzsimmons has highlighted, they're not at the moment a terribly diverse group. And in fact, it's gone backwards a bit. But it's going to have to be, the board of the future. The chair is really going to have to build an inclusive culture in the boardroom. And that's going to actually put the spotlight on diversity more broadly in the boardroom. In terms of challenges, so the internal challenge that people most identified was the sustainability of businesses. External, climate change, obviously that's a huge one. Fallout from COVID-19, economic instability, technology disruption, and cybersecurity. In terms of the top 3 skills that study identified, expertise in strategy, leadership and management, and technological know-how. And the top 3 attributes that a future director is going to need: strategic thinking, critical thinking, and values and ethics. So nothing in there really about, a good background in accounting and law. Quite different skill sets being identified as what you're going to need in the future. So I think in terms of my takeaways, look, big improvements on diversity when you think about where we came from 20 years ago, but lots more needs to be done. The other thing that I think fascinates me is that there's a traditional male category of sort of men appointing men and appointing men from a relatively shallow pool. Pale, male and stale is often how it's characterised. But we have a trend called golden skirts, so that there's a pool of women, and a lot of the women on the large listed boards quite often come from a very similar cohort. So we've seen a few standouts recently. I think the Telstra board has recently appointed quite a young woman with a very strong technology background, which actually makes absolute sense for that organisation. So I think that, and as a speaker at one of our national conference recently said, it's really going to have to be about the diversity of the women sitting around the boardroom table. We're kind of having to look at encouraging greater diversity beyond gender, and I think that's a very important conversation. I think organisations have to really sort of keep on track to make sure that they're meeting their milestones, and think about sort of building and strengthening the pipeline in the way that it's strong for men, so that we don't have this leakage out of the system. I think that's a very important thing. Interestingly, we do an annual ethics index, which is one of our big pieces of thought leadership each year. And on the top 12 ethical challenges for the coming 12 months is ensuring that there's gender balance in senior roles. So this index identifies that as an important challenge. I think there are some really major forces at work post-pandemic, and the top 3 skills that directors are going to need are expertise in strategy, leadership and technology. And the women who develop those skills, I think, are really setting themselves up for the future and really might well be in the driving seat when it comes to getting those senior appointments in organisations and also the senior board positions. So, I think it's going to be fascinating to unpack this when we've got a chance to have a bit more of a discussion, because I think there are some fascinating issues at play.
I completely agree. Some very interesting ideas out there. And I think the Board Diversity Index and the Annual Ethics Index is something that can be considered by other jurisdictions, such as India. I think another area to consider is gender diversity with a sector-specific focus, such as mining, because mining is a crucial industry in both countries. That's India as well as Australia. So I think there's scope to work there for both countries. Thank you so much for that presentation, Catherine. It was very well articulated and some very interesting key takeaways from there. With this, we move to our panelists from India. Joining us today is Ms. Sree Patel, Executive Director, Mondelēz International India. This company was formerly Cadbury India Limited. Apart from her role as Executive Director, Sree tenaciously manages the position of Chief Counsel at Mondelēz India Food Limited, or simply Mondelēz India. These roles are ably multitasked by her with the position of legal head in the area management team, or AMEA, within the company. Mondelēz India is a subsidiary of the internationally acclaimed food and snack giant, Mondelēz International, that reported a net revenue of US $27 billion in 2020, making it one of the leading conglomerates in the food segment globally. Previously, Mondelēz India was known as Cadbury India Limited, with the change in name brought to provide a uniform identity to all subsidiaries within the conglomerate. Sree is a recognized senior leader in India with a broad experience across pharmaceuticals, food, and FMCG sectors, and a demonstrable cross-disciplinary expertise in business strategy and corporate law. She serves as an independent director with Greaves Cotton Limited, a leading manufacturer of clean tech, powertrain solutions, and farm equipment. Her previous roles include Vice President, Legal and Corporate Affairs at GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceuticals Limited, where she worked for over 17 years. Giving it over now to Sree to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Divyangana. This was a very nice and a long introduction to me. I don't think I'm worthy of that. But thank you to you and the organizers for this opportunity. I must say I listened with great interest to our Australian panelists, Sarah, Terry, and Catherine, which was very interesting because of the Australian, shall we say, angle where they're doing so much better than we are perhaps in India, right? So we're probably at the other end of the spectrum, and very happy to perhaps share a little bit about our Indian situation and what does it mean for my women colleagues in India. So there are several obviously stakeholders in this process of getting to a place where we have a more diverse and certainly gender diverse boards. One of the challenges in India is, which is possibly not so acute in Australia, is really our culture, which is to an extent a lot more male dominated than it is in the more developed parts of this world, right? And therefore, to an extent, women in India start with perhaps a little bit of a disadvantage, because it's not just in the boardroom or in the company or in the corporate sphere, it is actually starting from home, where other than, say, women in the urban areas, right, who have the opportunity, perhaps like myself, to be able to go out and study and be able to work in outside of your home, not everybody has that choice, right? Having said that, I think we do realize and see in India, and I think one of our Australian panelists touched upon it, that some of our best students in every sphere are women, right? It's the girls who are acing math, it is the girls who are acing science, it is the girls who are in medicine to engineering to everywhere. But what happens to them in the journey to reach the boardroom? A lot of them, unfortunately, fall off the grid. Now, this could be the usual stuff like childcare or elderly care, because ultimately, even the most emancipated woman is really the primary caregiver in her home, right? So does that mean that we cannot aspire, and I use this word advisedly, aspire to where our colleagues in Australia have got? And I really believe that that's not so. We can, perhaps it will take us a little longer because of the environment that many of our really bright women grow up in. Not everybody has the opportunities that some of us have had, right? So as you would have heard from Divyangana on my background, I'm a lawyer by training, right? And what we have seen in, and you know, my co-panelists touched upon it, what we have seen is that certain functions or certain areas of the corporate world tend to be easier to, shall we say, rise up the ladder. And with no disrespect to other functions, but it is clear that certain functions are more women dominated and therefore have the opportunity to get to the higher echelons in the corporate. And these are obviously stuff like legal, finance, IT, the stuff where, you know, you don't actually have to perhaps work with your hands or be on your feet like manufacturing or sales. So in India, this is one of the biggest, shall we say, gaps that we see in the entire gender story. And in Mondelēz, and I'm really proud to say this, one of the greatest things that we have here is there is no gender bias in either promotions or indeed pay. And I think there are very few companies who can actually say that there is pay in gender, there is parity in gender pay, right? So it is, we are fortunate, right? That's not the situation in many other cases. And as we heard from our other panelists, there are certain sectoral biases, absolutely mining is one of them. But we also see that it is very common for more industrial manufacturing setups, even if they are manufacturing, say, engines, like the company I'm fortunate to be part of on the board. And that was really one of the reasons I wanted to be on that board, because I wanted to break this myth about, you know, women are only brought in either because they know finance or they know legal, etc. Because we can contribute to strategy. I think Catherine mentioned it really well. You need to dial up on the strategic aspect of being on a board. So, you know, I've talked a little bit about what the situation is, but what can we do to get to a better space, right? In my mind, there are, I think, 2 or 3 big stakeholders that need to be involved in this. A key one, of course, is the government or the regulators, who, in the way they create regulation or they create law, can actually have a sort of affirmative action. We have that in India, right? Where we do have women required to be at least one woman on every listed company beyond a certain size. Now that, you know, we could have women who turn around and say, we don't want to be favored. I understand that, right? But you need a step up, especially for countries like India, where you're starting with a you know, a negative, if you like, position. So I think that's really important. And we've seen the benefits of this in countries like Scandinavia, right? In all the 4 countries there, they have, and we've seen the way the women on boards have, really excelled and done brilliantly. So I think that's a key one, right? The second one I would say really are families, right? Because if you do not encourage your women to go out and be part of the marketplace, be part of the corporate setup, be part of an entrepreneur. You don't even need to be on corporates, you can be an entrepreneur. I'm afraid we will always be faced with some of the situations we are facing today. In India, though we have a regulation that we need to have women on boards, the fact remains that most of the women who are on boards today are family, right? Because these are Indian entrepreneurs who run some of the biggest corporates in India, and you will generally see that they are their wives or sisters or daughters are part of this. So, which is not to say that there are no professionals. Of course, there are, but clearly that is a gap and a divide that we need to move towards, to say, hey, when you're looking at a board member, because you're required to have one by the law, consider a professional. You might get a very diverse view and something that perhaps your family member may not be able to share, right? So I think that's the other piece, both in terms of family and boards. And the third one, and I'm going to say this loud and clear, is men, right? We tend to have, a lot of discussions on gender diversity with women involved. When are we going? And Terry, I'm so glad that you are on this panel, right? We really loved your thoughts and your perspectives. I think we need to have men part of this, men leading this, to say, you know what, we really think women can contribute as much, if not in some cases more than men can. And we really need that conversion early on in careers, early on, because you cannot have women on boards if they are not at the senior level. You have to have them go through the journey right to the board level, and we can only do this with the men. Again, men in families, men in corporates, men on the board. I think one of our panelists talked about, and I so believe that, right? The old boys club, right? Where it is comfortable, right? I don't blame them. It is comfortable to have somebody who looks like you, thinks like you, talks like you, to be on the board and maybe agree with everything that you want. But where is that challenge that you really need to take your board and the board's contribution to the next level? It's really something that is needed. When I was invited on the board of Reeves Cotton, which is essentially an engineering company moving into new age mobility solutions, one of my first questions to them was, are you seriously looking for an independent woman director, or do you want to fill or do a checkbox exercise? And it was actually very, very reassuring to know that they were. And it's been, you're allowed 2 terms in India, and I finished my first term, and in my second term, I think I got what was a really heartening view from the chairman of the board to say, you know what, we want to give you a second term because you bring a perspective that perhaps us engineers do not see. Because, the board, it's an engineering company and the board is full of engineers. So I think that's a testimony to the fact that we can bring perspectives into a board, which is, people would kind of say, what does a lawyer need to do in an engineering company board? And I believe that if you have a strategic bent of mind, you can look at and can contribute beyond your functional hat, while wearing what I call an organizational hat. And that's what we do on boards. And that is, I will leave this with the team to say, can we do, or can we look at ourselves beyond what is our training, beyond what's our experience, to dial up, as one of my panelists said, a strategic mindset, which is what is needed in that corner suite. Thank you so much.
Thank you for beautifully contextualizing the key theme of the webinar there, Sree. Such profound thoughts for us to ponder over, particularly when you started by saying, the environment that women grow up in, that is something that really needs to be considered if India wants to progress, both in terms of having a greater diversity at the senior level role and at the directorial level. And I think gender somewhere cannot be discounted from society. So with this, please let us invite Ms. Kalpana Unadkat, partner at Khaitan, one of the leading law firms in India. Kalpana is a seasoned legal professional carrying in-depth experience in corporate governance. She's experienced in providing advice on board effectiveness, leadership, and sustainable decision-making. Towards this end, Kalpana has conducted workshops to train more than 200 directors, equipping them to understand and develop their roles for efficient board performance. She has co-authored a research report, Women on Boards, a policy, process, and implementation roadmap that discusses legislative changes in India. So we've got hard law here that mandate listed companies to have at least one woman director. And this particular report is very important to understand that hard law. In fact, many of her points in the report echoed my own thoughts, which I hope to discuss later during the webinar or perhaps on another platform, given how we're placed with time. Let's see how we go. As a dual qualified lawyer, Kalpana is entitled to practice in India and England. She's registered as a solicitor with the Bombay Incorporated Law Society and the Law Society of England and Wales. Prior to her engagement with Khaitan, Kalpana worked at the London office of a prominent international law firm, Ashurst, where she pioneered the firm's India practice, along with establishing teams in Germany, Milan, Paris, and Singapore. Handing it over now to Kalpana to take the discussion forward.
Thank you so much, Divyangana. So good evening and actually good afternoon to my friends in India and in Australia. The best part of being towards the end, the speaker is that actually you don't have to talk much, I think. So probably I'm going to keep my talk very short and sweet. And I would like to have an interactive session with all of you. So first, I would like to thank JGU, CIAS, and Vahura for this kind invitation, and delighted to be part of this important discussion. And after hearing my co-panelists on diversity, and especially in the boardroom, also being on the board of, listed entities like DMart, TVS Group, and Eris Life Science, I do understand, when we talk about diversity in the boardroom, moving that needle takes time, right? But how are we going to create a more equitable future, right? First of all, in my view, I think business leaders need to take a pledge, just like climate we discussed, right? To advance more and more women into senior leadership position. What I mean by that, from managerial roles to board members. Immediate commitment is required that a woman member is represented in leadership roles in any organization. And when we look at to get more diversity in the leadership roles or on the board, how do we do that? We have to create more opportunities. Either by expanding the size of the boards, or we can add on the new roles. For example, why don't we create a role of vice chair on the board, or we create the role of co-leaders on committees, be it audit committee, nomination committee, or risk management committee, right? By adding these new roles, we are going to create opportunities for women leaders. Also, when we look at, nomination committee membership, I think it's important that we bring in more diversity even there so that a stronger pipeline is built. We talk about succession planning. I think most of the platforms where we have discussed governance, every time we hear about the succession planning at the executive level, we also need to focus on the succession planning at the board level, right? How are we going to build a leadership pipeline inside of a board so that the new members who are prepared, and how can we prepare them with these senior roles? I mean, we just heard about we can create mentorship, or can we have a focused development plans? In some cases, formal education if required, right? I mean, today, if you look at, there are a lot of courses being offered by various universities, especially on directorship courses. So I think when you look around, experienced directors are always going to be in demand when you look at the success of the board. My question is, are these directors ready to share these powers, which would help to fill the knowledge as well as the skill gap? We discussed about lawyers, finance. Is that the enough skill set? I think we are going beyond those skill sets now. Always the expertise of CEOs as well as CFOs is always going to be crucial to the board. But with the challenges that we are seeing today, whether it is digital transformation, CEO succession, or supply chain disturbance during the COVID times, I think more and more functional backgrounds and skill sets are very much needed on the board. It's beyond legal and finance now. So I personally believe that, diversifying the board is not as difficult as most people think, honestly. What sort of practices that it can be embodied so the task becomes easier for everyone? And the first important thing, it's not just at the board level, but also any organization, is that you have to set the tone at the top. By doing what? By embedding this diversity in your strategy. You cannot have a strategy where you don't talk about diversity, and walk the talk. That's very important. And just like everything else in life, right? You have to set the goals even for diversity on the board as well as leadership positions. Then diversity could be gender, race, ethnicity, anything. Let me tell you, boards which have gone ahead and set these diversity goals, they have made tremendous progress because there is a focused discussion. There is a focused process being put in place to achieve those goals. And those boards have built relationships with potential candidates outside the current board's network. So if you today look at it, somebody mentioned that how today's board members are being appointed. It is by word of mouth. One member knows another, and that's the same board coming back on the at the other companies as well. So how do we build relationships with potential candidates outside the current board network? Very, very important. You also have to use multiple resources to identify this skill set. Don't rely only on one person or your existing board members. Go beyond that. And this is very important when nomination and remuneration committee are looking at what sort of skill set is missing in the boards. Go beyond your current board candidates and check what else is available. Also, I think the nomination and remuneration committees have to start thinking, what is the skill set required for the future of the company, right? They should not just follow check the box attitude or the approach. I think it is given that knowledge and skill sets are the basics. You got to have that to get into the door. But what are the other factors? And when I look at other factors, I think today's days, I remember having discussions. self-image, self-awareness, whether the candidate is mature enough, and how would that person act as a member of the board? Because there is a social role as well. Are they going to abide by the duty of care? Do they understand what is fiduciary duties towards stakeholders, towards the company? Let's not forget, personality of the person is also very, very important. When we look at personality, what do I mean by that? Is the person collaborative or someone who is competitive, right? Other factor also when we discuss is that, is this person going to be present or are they going to be distracted by other commitments? It's very important. I mean, especially in India, we see, a lot of board members, they've got commitment to more than 5 companies, sometimes even 7 companies, right? And how are they going to be present and make sure that it's justified, that time is justified? Also, is this personality going to be dominant in the room or going to be shy and retired and wait for everyone else to come in? So I think there are a lot of factors that nomination remuneration committee need to look at beyond the knowledge and the skill set. I think we have reached a stage where knowledge and skill sets are given. They are the basics, which is required to get into the door. Also, you have to build the supply chain, right? In Indian laws, very much, and SEBI LODR regulations also, if we look at it, requires 1 woman on board. My co-panelist, Sree, also mentioned about that. How do we build that supply chain, right? How do we make sure that you are tracking promising diverse employees early in their careers and giving them the experience to move to the executive level and to the boardroom? We need to do that. Also, one of the ways, and I think quite a few companies, I understand even Tata's do that, is that they have diverse boards by appointing them on subsidiary boards so that they get experience and build the skill sets. So that's one of the ways one can, look at how you can build the skill set. And don't forget the power of sponsorship. I think Catherine mentioned about mentorship. I think we have gone beyond where just mentoring is required. I think we have reached a stage when we talk about diversity, we have to look at sponsorship in the organization. Within the organization, we need somebody to take that responsibility to ensure that how do we move a person from managerial role to executive role or to the board member. And that's where the sponsorship comes into picture. And at the end of the day, we have to foster an environment of openness, I would say, and also respect in board discussions and meetings, right? And that is the only way we are going to create an inclusive culture on the board. I think one is having a diverse board. That is just the beginning, but in my view, what is more important is, are you willing to listen to that diverse board and also pay attention to what that diversity brings, whether it is views and opinions, right? I think the way I look at the long-term solution to the root cause is, first of all, there is no succession planning when it comes to these roles, okay? And we need to ensure that the development as well as the succession planning is unbiased. There itself, people who are appointing the board members, there is no bias, right? And that's where I think the board leaders have to play a very, very active role. Without spending too much time, I think I would just say at the end of the day, we have to take this decision consciously. We have to move away from the tick the box approach, right? And I remember somebody mentioning this is that, either we are going to innovate or we all will die. So that says everything at the end of the day, right? Is that if you're talking about the governance, we must keep up space with the diversity, and you can't talk about the governance without the diversity. So with this, I would like to, end here and look forward to having a very interactive session. I'm happy to take the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an enlightening session with some very important thoughts there, Kalpana. I really like that point that one has to go beyond knowledge, because at least some level of knowledge or basic skill would be present with the candidate that's being considered, both for the CEO as well as for the board level role. And also going beyond mere mentorship to really sponsorship, having somebody push somebody through the ladder. But my concern then becomes that I hope it doesn't lead to some sort of a favoritism within the company. But of course, we have to sort of balance it out somewhere through internal policy or perhaps through regulations coming forth on that. Of course, we can now open the session to question and answers. We have a few questions here, and perhaps we can start with the first question on, do we need a cultural shift on boards and in organizations, generally with respect to executive directors? So now I'm taking a much more narrower focus on executive directors. And is there a mismatch between skills and board positions for women? Because what we hear in the Indian context often is that there aren't enough qualified women to take on executive roles. And I think somewhere we need to put this myth aside. So happy to hear thoughts both from the Australian context, whether they see something there similar, and from the Indian context. So happy to have any of the panelists address this question.
I think, Catherine, you'd agree that in Australia, we don't have a very high proportion of executive directors. They're mainly independents.
Mostly independents.
Yeah, so it would be very unusual, in fact, to have many executive directors on the board. So you might have the CEO report to the board, but they wouldn't be a board member, or the CFO might, or the COO might. But by and large, our boards are predominantly independent from our chairs, which I think are 99% of the ASX 200 are independent, not executive. So it's kind of a bit different for us. To even answer that question about executive directors on board, it's such a small population. It's not really the way we function from a governance point of view. Catherine, did you want to add to that?
No, I think I'd agree with that on the whole. But I suppose one thing I'd say is you'll often say, or one of the things that was always said was the best way to get on a board is to be the CEO of a company. So there's always been a sort of bias in favour of CEOs. But yeah, I'd agree. That's typically they're executive directors. That's kind of considered a bit old-fashioned in Australia these days.
So if you're looking at CEO as a pathway to director, and it is still the predominant pathway, then you're looking at, and this perhaps is where the biases come in and where we need to fix the pipeline. And I agree with at the very beginning, someone talked about the leaky pipeline, and that's actually caused by structural bias in Australia, but also more so culturally. I actually, Sree mentioned this, I've got a student from Indonesia who was looking at women on boards in Indonesia and women in CEO in Indonesia. And culture plays such a profound role in prohibiting women from reaching those roles, because culturally it's which is different in Australia. I know there's still the vestiges of it here, the idea of women being the primary carer, but culturally that's still deeply embedded in Southeast Asia. And I'm not sure, that's another issue that we've kind of, we've got in our background, but it doesn't play as big a role. But structurally for us, things like childcare are significant inhibitors to career. Our system's pretty antiquated. It's costly. It doesn't operate in the hours that an executive would need to operate. Even someone in junior management or middle management, when the chips are down, and it certainly doesn't support an operational career, which is what leads to CEO. It's very, very rare here for a CEO to come from a support role. They usually come from an operational, whether it's not directly COO roles, but if you look at the proportion of CEOs, most come from COO, some from CFO. But it's really about addressing gender imbalance in pressures on women structurally around childcare, around parental leave, and the way that even in Australia we have a disproportionate parental leave system where women are, inverted commas, advantaged through leave and pay, and men don't really have the option of taking up the extra burden or help because they receive a limited amount. Things like that need to be addressed to equalise opportunity. But also, I totally agree with the sponsorship issue. In Australia, when I was looking at what the primary drivers of women board members, and I didn't mention this when I was speaking, but the AICD's mentoring program was massively important because the women that are now on our boards, particularly the chairs, went through that mentoring program. And even though it's called the mentoring program, the chairs involved in that ended up sponsoring. So when a role came up, they would talk to their fellow chairs and say, well, who were you mentoring? And the mentor would be putting forward those candidates for board roles by those other chairs. So sponsorship is critical. So there's quite a few areas where we can intervene to succeed.
I think also, the pandemic, and I don't know whether it's the same in India, but the pandemic has accentuated this sort of gender bias in favour of caring. There's been quite a lot of discussion about that. It's sort of when the chips are down and you working from home, mum picks up the thing. Look, I've never had a cent of parental leave. My eldest is 24, my youngest is 19. Just wasn't a thing. Never been paid for it. I was privileged to have the time off and have a job to come back to, but no paid parental leave.
So
and you're lucky if you don't. Yeah.
If I may, from India perspective, I think I should share this story. It's important. And I just mentioned that we need business leader and the CEO level to take a pledge how they create a pipeline of senior leaders, women leaders. But when I was doing this research, Women on Board, couple of years ago, I had done roundtable conference and I went to 7 different cities in India and met with the CEOs and CFOs. In Hyderabad, we met an IT company, CEOs and CFOs. And at that time, it was not mandatory to have one woman on board. We were still doing research for the government. And when we were discussing this with the CEOs and CFOs, the CEO told me, I said, look, Kalpana, whether this law comes into play or not, I already have a pipeline of senior women leaders within my organization. And at that time, they already had 2 women leaders who were sitting on the board of that company. Of course, it's an IT company. Now we heard Sree. She is already an executive director at Mondelēz. So I think we need to take a conscious decision at senior leadership level and build that pipeline. Is everybody doing that? No. So this was Hyderabad IT company CEO telling me. At the same time, when I went to Calcutta, the promoter told me, why do I need an independent woman on board? Just like how my brother is on the board or my son is on the board, I can have a daughter and sister, which is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong because she would still bring a diverse view in the boardroom, the way I look at it. But I think, again, in India, it's what happens in within one part of India would be very different if you go to different parts. But we have had cases where actually IT company, this CEO, he said, we already have 2 women directors on the board, even though law doesn't require. So I think it is going to change. Even in India, it's slow, but it would happen, I think. I don't know, Sree, if you have anything to add.
It's interesting, though, we don't have the strong tradition. You do get that strong tradition in Southeast Asia and India of, women from the family just take their place on the board. So we don't necessarily, if you think of the big family companies in Australia, we don't have that same thing. You've got some, we were talking before we started about, the most successful entrepreneur in India is a woman. What was the company? I've forgotten. We were talking about it earlier. She listed last week, that woman.
Nika.
Yeah, massively successful. We just don't have a similar phenomenon, I don't think.
So
I
we
think
do have other examples like Biocon, right? Ms. Shaw is Kiran Shaw. She's fantastic, and she is in a hardcore science company, right? She started it on her own, and she's done. But I mean, Kalpana is right? It is different in different parts of the country. But I think there is an opportunity for us to do more. While there are great examples of what we've just discussed, they are few and far in between. I think we do need a lot more concerted effort to have women in executive director positions for sure. There's no question.
My next question is slightly technical in nature, more from an academic perspective, because we do have an academic panelist with us. Law cannot be alienated from society if it is to function effectively. I think both Kalpana and Sree have sort of highlighted that, and even Catherine to some extent. So in this regard, we are following the Pierre Bourdieu sociological framework that helps us understand the dynamics between power structures and human capital, such as knowledge and skills, procured by virtue of a candidate's what we call as social capital, that is the contacts built and the membership of the organizations held. So for example, a directorial candidate with qualifications from Harvard University would have access to better contacts that will enable the candidate to capitalize not only on the qualification from Harvard University, but also the networks built around there, causing an unequal level playing field for those who don't have access. So how does this Pierre Bourdieu framework impact women? And if the observations if the observations from the framework are to be translated into a legal and regulatory space, how can it be done? So how is theory translating into practice for law?
That's a very big question. I think, so look, I would argue that the capital side of it, social capital aside, so the human capital side of it, is established by the market. That is that the market itself determines what, and I'm not saying the market's perfect, but the market kind of determines what are the skills that we expect in our board. So the shareholders have a big say in A, who they appoint to the board, and B, whether they're happy with who's on the board. And so that's why you see this operational dominance. And I don't think that's going to disappear. People are going to say, look, has that person been there and done it? Have they actually done it? Have they survived the risks, been through the economic downturns? Have they had a career that spans this entire industry? They know it back to the front. I'm more likely to feel comfortable that risking my capital with that person. So I don't know that's going to shift greatly, but that's not exactly the same thing as talking about what we need as a proportion on the board. And I think Catherine mentioned this, that there are capitals that are going to be needed in the future that I think we're being a bit slow on taking up.
Yeah.
The risks of the future, we know, climate change is an obvious one. That is going to drive massive shifts in economies, if not change in our environment. So our board's awake to that. Technology is the other one that was raised, and I totally agree again. We've seen that in the pandemic, how critical and how quick the shift was in technology, and how boards were very unprepared, actually, on the rapidity of that take-up and the ongoing ramifications. We're still in the early days of seeing the implications of COVID on business. So there are two areas where I think capital will shift. But it requires the field. So again, Bourdieu talks about field capital and habitus. So the field is dominated still by institutions that are dominated by men. It's not to say there aren't women present. There were certainly women present in the Corporate Governance Review Board. The ASX's Corporate Governance Principles Board. So, there are women there, but still there's this male way of thinking about things in the field. And what's changing that, so what's shifting the field, is there's just this volume of evidence of coming through around causality of women and on boards. There's, in terms of a business case, there is nothing better than proof to a board and shareholders particularly and investors that having a diverse board produces better outcomes. I mean, we can talk about it's the right thing to do, and of course it is, and that's the equitable thing to do, and of course it is, and inclusion is the right thing to do. But in a capital market, it resonates a lot more with shareholders, the uneducated in terms of gender. When you start saying, hey, here's the evidence, gender diversity on the board, gender diversity in senior management. That will actually shift power or thinking around the field of power so that men are inclined to appoint women, rather than having to this argument that we need more women on boards to appoint more women, which I think is unfair, first of all, to put that burden on women. And it needs men to come on board, but the evidence is there. So I guess the field is changing. The last bit of board use equation is habitus, and that's our lived experience. We have, and this is where I agree with absolutely everything that's been said about obligations of firms to bring women through. Training and development, keeping an idea on progression rates in each role, career opportunities, moving women into operational roles as much as men. So one of the things we found in our study is that firms that do this well measure everything. They have an eye to every aspect of, retirement, graduates coming in, making sure that people stay in the role for the same length of time. We're not being unfair or biased in our selection. All of those elements have to be managed. And in fact, the board provides the ultimate governance and accountability to senior management around all of those metrics. So they're kind of how those three elements work together to create a shift, which we've seen or we're seeing happen now.
And I think Sree made a good point just in terms of, having people come through the system. What have you seen work well, Sree?
It's, So it is mixed, right? As I said, certain functions and certain industries or sectors have a larger proportion coming through the system, whereas others don't. So the areas that we find particularly low are, as I mentioned, sales and manufacturing. Very, very few. I could probably count them on the back of my hand. But in other sectors, advertising, for example, a lot more women are coming through the system,
So, we've got all these girls acing every subject in university and qualifying at a phenomenal rate. And it's translating that. Yeah.
That's true.
And I don't think it's just childbearing. I think
it isn't. You're absolutely right. It's not. It's not just childbearing, because they're not dropping off at the childbearing age. They're actually dropping off at a mid to senior management because of perhaps a bias towards, can she do this job? And I think all of us know who work in this field that women are hesitant to put their hand up, even if they're 100% ready, whereas a man will put his hand up even if he's 70% ready, right? We've seen statistics there. So we are more hesitant to actually push our way into senior management, forget boardrooms.
I was literally having that conversation with a colleague today. It was very funny you should mention it. Yeah. And so does that come from the point that Terry was just raising about, is there a particular type of confident young man of a certain background who will make his way in the world faster just because the cards are stacked? He's holding more cards.
Yep. Certainly in environments like India, right, where the cards are stacked against women to a certain degree, right? Because by virtue of you being born a male, you actually have a head start.
Can I just jump in here too to say that, I think this point about women not putting themselves forward is really interesting, whether they don't put themselves forward because they don't feel qualified, or they don't put themselves forward because there's some aspect of their work-life balance that they think can't be overcome. So, in terms of mentorship and sponsorship of women, I think it's also about having the conversation that says, I think you're ready for this role. What do you feel is holding you back? And sometimes women will say to you, I don't feel qualified. But sometimes they'll say something as simple as, I'm worried about how much travel the role might involve because I have a caring responsibility for elderly parents. And so then it becomes also a conversation around, okay, well, how can we help you manage that? If the trips are short, if we're prepared to sort of say, travel with your nanny if you need to bring your child, and making those adjustments to keep your talent profile of women moving up the pathway.
And I suppose the other thing to be aware of is we are a very privileged sample. There are not many people who can afford to travel with a nanny or as a cohort, we have a lot of advantages, but there's a lot more smart girls out there.
You're right. And to your point, Sarah, I think it is certainly a mix of both, where women feel perhaps not equipped to take the next job, not merely because of caring, etc. But there is also this unconscious bias, which assumes that a woman cannot do this job because perhaps she can't travel. Have you asked her? We don't even ask.
Exactly.
Right? So
she won't want to go on that trip because she's pregnant, which maybe she can travel when she's pregnant, right? There's no reason not. Yeah.
That's right. It's a very tough job. You have to manage so many people. The very militant people in the factory. You can't do a manufacturing job. And that's they're starting off with an assumption, which arises from unconscious bias, where and they think it's, I'm very caring about the woman because I'm thinking about, how she perhaps will be uncomfortable doing this. It's this whole patriarchal view, right? Oh, you poor thing. You ask her.
Manage my youngest son and then see what fit you for any managing a terrorist. Easy.
Yes, we've been there.
Right.
They're
so
more rational.
We'll quickly take 3 questions and then probably wrap up there because we're mindful of the time. Of course, just building on.
Sorry, Divya, I'm going to have to go. I have another appointment, but thank you so much for having me. It's been really very, very interesting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being there for us.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye. So quickly, we'll just take up 3 questions, just building on what Sree and Catherine were speaking of earlier, that of course, we need to encourage women to come up and speak more often, but also, on the other hand, for companies to listen. So what incentives can company or the law, both in terms of soft law as well as hard law, adopt to encourage women in considering these executive director roles? So that's one question. The second question from a much more Indian context is that generally India prefers hard law. And so we've got section 149 of the Companies Act over here that requires one woman director to be appointed in all listed companies. And in certain public companies, we've got Regulation 17, Sub-Regulation 1 of the SEBI Listing Obligations and Disclosure Requirement Regulations of 2015 that mandate the top 1,000 listed companies to appoint one woman, and I emphasize independent director. So the regulations themselves are directing the companies somewhere to take up women as independent directors and not really thinking so much about women as executive directors. So number one, is the numeric figure of having one woman director enough? Also, is the law in India perceived not to encourage women as executive directors? And lastly, we've got, again, from an Indian context, cases where the company law tribunal here that has accepted non-compliance of appointing a woman director as what we call as a compoundable offense, which means defaulting officers and the company can simply settle the dispute by paying a fine. This was because if you look at even some of the judgments coming from the company law tribunal, they've said that a failure to appoint a woman director is not perceived, and I quote, prejudicial to shareholders, creditors, and the public at large. Is this rationale truly justified, or does it undermine the essence of mandating one woman director on corporate boards? And what can be done to change this mindset? So I'm going to leave these questions for the panelists to, of course, think over and provide their suggestions.
So if I may start.
What's the composition of the court that made that decision?
So I would, if it is all right, let me take that last question and the court, why did the court take that decision? I think this also stems from what Terry was saying, right? Whether the non-appointment causes prejudice to shareholders or the creditors or the stakeholders. That's what the court looked at. For example, if you look at today in India on public sector companies undertaking where the central government has not appointed independent director on a lot of those companies, right? Has that caused an adverse event or impact? See, yes, I agree. Being a lawyer, it is non-compliance per se, right? But you don't have to show it caused any prejudice to the stakeholders. There are certain things what Terry mentioned that market should respond. And I think this is one thing which markets should respond. And if you look around the data, it is responding. The shareholders today are valuing, or rather, I would say they will undervalue the companies which have poor corporate governance, which also includes diversity. So in my view, let the shareholders and the market decide. I think government has done enough. We in India, we anyway have enough laws. I think government has done the right things by mandating the companies to have women director. That's very important. Now it is up to the shareholders and the stakeholders relevant. Let's go beyond shareholders and say, how do we stick to the corporate governance where the companies, where the senior management is diverse? I think the market always reacts. And I think let the market decide. That's my view.
Perhaps I can build on what Kalpana said. It's a very good point, right? I think the other piece to remember is that law is only what it is on paper. If somebody wants to really contravene it, you don't need to not have a woman independent director. You can just get a spokesperson, somebody who's like your spokesperson, right? Who is not going to actually add any value, and more importantly, not come in the way of your doing what you want on the board. So it's very easy to circumvent that law. So to your question, should it not have been more strict? I agree. It should be, but the fact remains that it is such an easily circumventable law that the penalty is perhaps not what we should be looking at, versus saying, how can we really make this more effective when you say, I want an independent woman director on the board?
Or for that matter, even executive director. Let's look at it. When you look at listed companies where there is diversity and where there is governance, you look at the way the stock reacts, market reacts to that. So I think we are going to see that more and more.
I think so. One of the big shifts we had in 2015 in Australia was the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, and that's unique to Australia. We have compulsory superannuation, which then gets invested in companies, among other infrastructure projects and whatnot. But our industry super funds control nearly 12% of every company. Now, that's a big chunk. And if you've got a diverse shareholder portfolio in your company, 10 or 12% is all the difference on a vote. So when the Council of Superannuation Investors says, and they did in 2015 to these companies, if you don't have a woman on the board, we won't vote for your REM report, or we won't support your chair nomination, or that's big.
Powerful.
Yeah.
And that's the market driving change. Now, I know that's unique to Australia, but the same went before that with evidence around profitability. When people actually believe that, it's one thing to say it, but when shareholders and boards actually believe that, then they drive change because it's actually driving better outcomes for shareholders. But until you get to that tipping point, legislation probably has, a little bit that it can do. But I think ultimately it's about educating the market and convincing people of the case.
I think too, the other thing that we're seeing in Australia and globally really is the big index funds, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards. They're driving really strong ESG agendas.
Yes.
And we're seeing that on climate. So, that whole ESG agenda is really being driven by the very big institutional investors. So I think that's having, in addition to this sort of Australian specific thing at the superannuation funds, I think we're seeing globally these are issues that the big investors are really active about and voting.
Yeah, let me share with you, being a lawyer, when I'm actually working on transactions, we never had earlier private equity investors when they were investing in portfolio or target companies. They never asked questions on corporate governance. They never asked questions on diversity. Now, even the first due diligence checklist, we have changed the template to have that paragraph. Why? Because those questions, absolutely, it's necessary. You look at any big funds, why big, any private equity funds. They are asking for governance. They are asking who is on the board. Is there a diversity on board? If not, let's put that in place. What's your plan? So I think things are changing and we are going to see that. So I think let the market and the investors decide that. And ESG, let's say how many, 5 years or 10 years ago, how many investors were asking about ESG compliance? I think diversity is just like that.
Well, and a lot of investors see gender diversity as part of the whole ESG package.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's like modern slavery. It's just another of those important S risks that you've got to manage, really.
All right, so I think that sort of brings us towards the end of the question and answer session. And thank you so much to the panelists for giving us their time. I will, of course, now like to take a moment to thank our amazing speakers for providing their views on a topic that has garnered a raging debate in both India and Australia, and for positively contributing to the discussion through best practices, such as sponsorship, for both countries to consider and help each other grow in corporate governance. My sincerest gratitude to the Australian government for supporting our project on promoting women in leadership, diversity on boards in India and Australia, in particular Ms. Kirlew and Ms. Janaki Sriram and their team. We are deeply appreciative of the support provided by our leading partners, the University of Queensland, Australia-India Business Council, or AIBC, and the Institute for Australia-India Engagement, or IAIE. We also thank Vahura on Boards, our knowledge partner for the webinar. Last but not least, we thank the participants both on Zoom as well as YouTube for being such a wonderful audience. And of course, if there are no further thoughts, we can close the session. But if there are further thoughts, we can, of course, get a few views from the speakers if they would like to share any last minute thoughts.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. All right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. So
Bye.
we'll close the session now. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.